so thrilled and delighted to be part of this amazing event where people cluster together to learn from each other, to teach one another. It really is, in some sense, the city writ small. I want to start with a picture of America, and I call it a picture to really demonstrate how completely lacking in any aesthetic sense whatsoever I am. But what this is I've split up the 3,000-odd counties in the United States into tenths, 300 in each point, and grouped them on the basis of density. Because cities at their heart are the absence of physical space between people. They are proximity, closeness, density. And the bottom line shows the relationship between incomes and density. The bottom line shows that the most dense tenth of America's counties have average incomes that are on average 50% higher than incomes in the least dense half of America's counties. This is a general phenomenon. It's not driven by selection of people who are more able into cities or the presence of things like ports that cause cities to come about. It's connected to the fact that the three largest metropolitan areas in this country produce 18% of our GDP, while including only 13% of our population. And if all of America's incomes rose to the per capita level seen in the New York metropolitan areas, our national GDP would go up by 43%. Now, the top line shows the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 and initial density. So whereas at the start of the 19th century we're relieving our dense enclaves to populate the empty spaces of America, in the start of the 21st century we're increasingly moving to be close to one another, to the areas where there already are a lot of people. Far from spreading out, we are clustering in. Now, this is the success of cities in the West, but the success of cities is so far more dramatic in the developing world. We have just recently passed this amazing halfway point where more than half of humanity lives in cities. And it's hard not to think that that's by and large a good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third. Gandhi famously said, "The future of the nation lies not in its villages, not in its cities, but in its villages." But with all due respect to the great man, he was completely and utterly wrong. The future of India lies in its cities. Now, in some sense, this is a surprise, and it's a surprise both because of history. Because in the 1970s, all of our older, colder cities looked like they were headed for the trash heap of history. That not just Ford, but history itself was telling New York that it was going to drop dead, and that it was headed towards some sort of primeval wasteland, like Planet of the Apes, with the Statue of Liberty sitting up through the sand. And it's even more amazing because we live in an age in which it is effortless to telecommute across the planet, in which we could all just go to whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia and just dial it in. And yet, in so many ways, in so many places, we choose the inconveniences of city life. We choose to be close to one another. Why hasn't, as the cyberseers and techno-prophets told us 30 years ago, why hasn't all this connection, all the internet, all the electronic connections made cities obsolete? The reason why is that the primary effect of globalization and new technologies has been to increase the returns to being smart. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. This is what cities do. They are machines for learning. They play to our greatest talent, which is our ability to learn from the people around us. We come out of the womb with this remarkable ability to soak up information from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, even occasionally from our teachers. And the more complicated the world is, the more valuable it is to be in the same room where you can make sure that things don't get lost in translation. Google, of all the companies in the world, should be able to have long-distance production, and yet they build the Googleplex. Now, this explains why it is that skills are so primary in explaining which cities succeed, why Boston is different than Buffalo. This is the relationship between education as of the year 2000 and subsequent population growth. Having a land-grant college in your city prior to 1940 is an extraordinary good predictor of urban success after 1980. And of course, our own land-grant college is MIT, right, which has played an outsized role. Education, as the share of the population with a college degree in your metropolitan area goes up by 10%, your wages go up by an average by 8%, holding your levels of education constant. Now, of course, many of the most important skills in cities are taught after you go to school. And that's why urban entrepreneurship, which is learned on the streets over time, seems to be such a potent predictor. This is one of our very mediocre measures of the entrepreneurial skills, which is average establishment size, a very potent predictor of which areas go together. But really, skills are really the lifeblood of cities. And it's because of this connection between cities and skills that cities are proving to be more, not less important over time. And I'll answer that in a question. Thank you.
Aren't you impressed by the extent to which economists have numbers at their fingertips? It's amazing. Questions, please. What's your prediction for where it's going to go? It's just gone above a half of the world's population living in cities. Presumably there's some upper limit to this. We can't have 100% of the population living in cities because someone's got to grow the food, right?
And it's a wonderful thing that we have choice in this country. Not everyone should live in a city. It's a great thing that we have different options. But certainly the percentage that are going to be living in cities is higher and higher. And it's hard not to think that that's a good thing. Also a good thing for environmental reasons, right? Because in fact, people who live in cities typically use considerably less energy because they drive shorter distances, and holding income and family size constant, they live in smaller dwelling units. And that's what the Thoreau thing is, to remind us that Thoreau, although he lived out in Walden, burned down more than 300 acres of prime Concord woodland while he was surrounding himself by the woods, reminding us that living around trees isn't necessarily the best way to love nature.
Do I hear somebody from Harvard talking down the New England Transcendentalists?
Yeah. In this spot, hallowed spot of all ground. And I actually, I live not so far away from Walden Pond, and when we moved out, when we started acquiring small children about 6 years ago, I started doing about as much damage to the environment as Thoreau did. So I know of what I speak on this thing.
A question here.
Hello. As you know, specialization is the lifeblood of cities. Do you think there's a limit to how specified our jobs can get?
Oh, Durkheim redux, huh? Look, I think it's very, very hard whether or not the overall trend is even more towards more or less specialization. It depends on different fields. Actually, I would argue within economics we've become less specialized, and part of the magic, okay, is that you often find new ideas by combining old ideas. This is a point that Jane Jacobs made, and in fact some ability to look across fields is critical in the inventive process. This is also true at the city level, that there's a robust connection between urban diversity rather than specialization and long-run growth, because the ability to borrow, to choose some idea from a different field is critical to the innovation process. And that's why, in fact, I think there are profound limits on specialization, both of the personal level and on the city level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Over here, please.
Thank you. And so instead of a takeaway for me from the talk to think that everyone's moving into the city, I'm more curious about the aspect of the profit or the benefit of the city being education. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the city being right at different phases of your life. So the city being right for you either as you're an undergrad, or the country being right and then you move to city immediately after undergrad, and what it's like to be there for a decade or two, but say you don't want to be in the city when you get to a certain point. Can you speak to that?
It's about choices. It's a great thing, as I said, that America has different options for different people, and not everyone should live in a city, by all means. Now, it is certainly true that cities are more or less right for different types of people. So cities typically attract the very rich and the very poor. A critical point about urban poverty is that urban poverty should not be taken as a sign of urban failure, because cities don't make people poor. They attract poor people with the promise of economic opportunity, with the ability to get around without a car for every adult. My own work shows that as you build subway stops in an area, the nearby poverty rate goes up. Not because subways are impoverishing those people, but in fact because poor people are doing something perfectly rational, which is moving to a dense urban area so they can get around without a car. The same thing is true in terms of the age distribution. Cities are good for the very young. They're marriage markets. They deliver the proximity that is so valuable for young single people to other young single people. But of course, they're also good for people who are at the older age of the distribution, because they don't involve long amounts of driving. Now, the critical failure of our cities is that it does such a bad job for parents in the middle of the age distribution, and for people in the middle of the income distribution. But that isn't something that's innate to cities. Okay? There are cities throughout this world, like London and Paris, that have fantastic public school systems. It is the way that we have specifically designed our local public school system that actually makes cities so much of a repellent force for many middle-income parents who feel like they have to move to suburbs to get public schools.
Please, over here.
Countries that you know of where this pattern doesn't hold?
Countries where urbanization is actually declining?
Or not significant?
Well, urbanization tends to go along with income. It's a very strong correlation with income across countries. So countries that are trapped in poverty tend not to be urbanizing, and there tends to be a limit, right? I mean, you tend to sort of curve off at 80 or 90%. It's sort of a typical S-shaped curve. The critical thing, I think, in terms of thinking about the urbanization of the poorer world, is to be very aware of the enormous difficulties that the cities in these places have, but to respond not by thinking, wouldn't it be great if people just lived on the farms, because there is no future in rural poverty. The right answer is to actually make our cities, make the developing cities of the poor world better, healthier, safer.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we're just about out of time, sir, so I think we're going to have to move on. There won't be time to answer the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.